Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the heavy heat of the Nile's midnight air, the kind that makes the river shine like liquid bronze. You hear the frogs, the distant rattle of a boatman's oar, and the faint perfume of blue lotus flowers drifting from unseen courtyards. It's Egypt, yes, but not the polite museum version with tidy statues and glass cases. No, you're wandering into the whispers, the candle-lit corners, the practices so strange that you probably won't survive this bedtime tale without at least raising an eyebrow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a world where forbidden whispers ripple like the Nile's current. Imagine a priest leaning closer than polite distance allows, telling a young initiate that the gods demand rituals no outsider should ever witness. You'd probably try not to laugh nervously, but the flickering lamps make every shadow feel complicit. Egyptians were fascinated with rules about purity, rules about intimacy, and naturally rules about breaking those rules. And the closer you were to the temples, the thicker those regulations became. One mainstream fact anchors you here. In ancient Egypt, sexuality was tied directly to cosmic order, what they called ma'at. To them, intimacy wasn't just personal. It was political, religious, and dangerously powerful. Think of it as less romantic dinner and more cosmic paperwork. If you didn't get it right, the universe itself might wobble out of balance. No pressure, of course. And then there were the quirky tidbits like hushed claims that attain priests used coded handshakes to signal ritual readiness. Imagine a secret club where your handshake could get you admitted not into a poker game but into a temple rite that blended incense, chanting, and suspiciously awkward silence. You can't exactly imagine that catching on at your local gym unless historians really did miss something. Speaking of historians, they still argue whether these whispers were actual physical acts or symbolic performances carefully choreographed for the eyes of the gods alone. One school insists the stories are exaggerated by later gossip, while another swears the ancients were far bolder than their papyrus etiquette manuals suggest. You're left drifting between theories, both tantalizing, neither conclusive. As you shuffle through this candlelit world, you realize secrecy itself was the power. The less people knew, the more control the priests held. That's why whispered rules spread like wildfire, always changing, always confusing, always keeping common folk just curious enough to obey. It's the perfect recipe for authority. Keep things mysterious, keep them terrifying, and sprinkle in a little cosmic doom if anyone dared laugh at the wrong time. You imagine yourself standing in the temple's outer courtyard, the heat sticking your linen tunic to your back, while a guard eyes you suspiciously. You're not supposed to be here, but you've slipped in anyway. A voice echoes from the inner chamber, repeating phrases you can't quite understand, except for the words forbidden, sacred, and "was that honey?" You probably heard that wrong, but the image sticks anyway. A little humor slips in too. Because if secrecy was the power, you can bet someone, somewhere, was abusing it. Picture the ancient equivalent of a teenager saying, "Oh no, Mum, the gods require me to stay out all night." Plausible? Maybe not. But history is full of mischievous gaps, and Egyptians were human after all. Still, you can't shake the unease of these whispered rules. They blur boundaries between devotion and desire, between piety and power. You can't help wondering what would happen if you followed one of those priests deeper into the glow of the oil lamps, past the hieroglyph-covered walls, into the chambers where whispers become acts. Acts you'll never quite know if they were symbolic, sacred, or scandalous. The Nile air thickens as you step closer. The frogs fall silent, and in the distance, someone exhales slowly, as if reminding you some whispers are not meant to be repeated. You wander deeper into the shadowy temple halls, and suddenly you realize the rules you overheard in the courtyard aren't just about people. They're modeled after gods themselves. The Egyptians believed their deities were not aloof marble statues, but flesh and blood beings with messy love lives, rivalries, and, yes, a flair for scandal. And here you are, watching how those divine dramas spilled right into human rituals. Take Osiris and Isis. Their story wasn't just one of love, but of resurrection, intimacy, and cosmic duty. When Osiris was dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis supposedly reassembled his body, piece by piece, and then, well, let's just say she didn't wait around for him to fully heal. The myth claimed she fashioned what was missing, and the union that followed gave birth to Horus, the falcon god. You're standing here, imagining priests retelling this story by lamplight, and you can't help but think, that's not exactly the bedtime story you'd want for your kids. But to the Egyptians, these divine couplings were cosmic blueprints. If the gods did it, then mortals were supposed to mimic it within certain whispered ritual boundaries. That's your mainstream fact. Divine intimacy served as a justification for human practices. It's as if the gods were the ultimate influencers, and you were supposed to hit like by reenacting their stories in temple rites. And then come the quirky tidbits. One lesser-known version of the myth claims that Isis used a wax figure, not a resurrected Osiris, in their union. Imagine the priest telling this with a straight face, while initiates nod solemnly, and you're in the back row thinking, did ancient Egypt invent the world's first candlelight experiment? The line between devotion and awkward practicality was often thinner than papyrus itself. Of course, historians still argue whether these myth-based rituals we reacted out literally or performed in symbolic dances and chants. One camp insists there's no way priests would engage in anything physical under the eyes of their god statues. Another argues that reenactment was exactly the point, that by embodying Isis and Osiris, they kept the universe itself humming. You're left standing between the scholars, shrugging, thinking, either way, it sounds like the world's weirdest improv theatre. The further you walk, the clearer it becomes. Gods behind closed doors shaped every corner of daily life. Imagine hearing farmers in the fields gossiping about which myth justified which festival, or a couple invoking Isis's name before starting a family. Even the Nile's flooding cycle was linked to the tears of Isis, mourning Osiris. Devotion, water, fertility, it was all wrapped together in myth, and every whisper carried the weight of a universe teetering on balance. You slip past a curtain into another chamber. Here, statues of Hathor, goddess of love and joy, gaze down with almond-shaped eyes. She was sometimes depicted as a cow, sometimes as a beautiful woman, and her rituals often included music, dancing, and intoxicating drinks. If Isis and Osiris were the serious, dramatic couple, Hathor was the friend who showed up with a tambourine and too much beer. You sense the humour in that, because even in these solemn temples someone must have laughed when worshippers tried to dance like Hathor after 3 cups of honey wine. But beneath the jokes lies control. Priests carefully dictated which myths were told, how they were acted out, and who was allowed to watch. For common people, these stories were less about freedom and more about submission. Obey the gods, honor the myths, and maybe, just maybe, your crops will grow, your children will thrive, and your afterlife won't be an awkward conversation with Anubis. You pause near a carved relief showing Hathor embracing Horus, her son in some tales, her lover in others. You tilt your head and squint, and suddenly you feel the awkwardness the ancient Egyptians must have felt too. Did they question these contradictions? Probably. Did the priests admit to the confusion? Absolutely not. Control thrives on mystery, and the more tangled the divine love lives became, the more justification existed for equally tangled human rituals. The air smells of burning resin as you back slowly toward the doorway. Behind you, the gods still stand frozen in mid-embrace. Silent models for acts humans dared to whisper about but rarely explain. Somewhere in the temple, a chant begins, slow, rhythmic, haunting. It rises and falls like breath itself, and you realize, here in Egypt, even the gods weren't immune to the bedroom drama. You drift past the temple's incense-heavy air into a corridor that smells less sacred and more like sweat, perfume, and power. This is no public shrine, it's the passage to the pharaoh's private chambers, and while scribes filled papyrus scrolls with carefully polished praises of their rulers, the whispers here told very different stories. Picture the pharaoh's bed not as a romantic refuge, but as a stage where politics, religion, and personal appetites collided. A mainstream fact here, pharaohs were considered divine, the living embodiment of Horus. Their private acts weren't just personal, they were cosmic performances meant to prove fertility, stability, and legitimacy. If the king failed in these roles, the entire kingdom supposedly risked collapse. So yes, no pressure there. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep with the fate of the universe tucked under your bed sheets. And yet, the whispers insist those chambers weren't just about duty. Quirky tidbit time. Certain pharaohs allegedly had elaborate perfume fountains in their rooms, mechanisms that spritzed exotic scents like myrrh and lotus during encounters. Was this romance or an ancient attempt at air freshener? Hard to say, but you can't help picturing some royal engineer being ordered, "Build me a device that makes the room smell seductive or you're fired." Historians still argue whether these fountains were real inventions or just poetic exaggerations scribes used to flatter their kings. Either way, it's hard not to imagine the pharaoh lounging there, enveloped in a mist of imported cinnamon while pretending to be above it all. You step quietly into the chamber, where the bed is enormous, enough to hold not just a partner, but a political negotiation. Marriage in these quarters often wasn't about love at all, but about alliances. A foreign princess sent from another kingdom might find herself here, not because of personal charm, but because her father signed a treaty. Picture being that envoy bride, standing in a gilded room, wondering whether you've just saved your nation or doomed yourself to years of awkward ceremonies. Of course, some pharaohs leaned fully into the whispers. Ramesses II, for example, filled his palace with wives and concubines, as though his political strategy was simply to overwhelm the future with children. Meanwhile, Amenhotep III was said to celebrate his virility with statues that made it clear the man was proud of his contributions. You glance at those statues and think, that's a level of self-confidence even Instagram influencers would envy. Still, there's a darker edge to this opulence. Behind the gilded doors, the pharaoh's desires could tip into obsession. Historians debate whether Akhenaten's unusual depictions, elongated features, almost feminine curves, suggested he challenged gender norms in his private life. Was he experimenting with roles in the bedroom, or were artists simply portraying divine otherworldliness? The arguments rage on, leaving you standing in the middle of the chamber, half intrigued, half exasperated, wondering if the truth lies hidden in papyrus fragments gathering dust somewhere. You run your hand along the painted walls and notice scenes of Hathor, goddess of love, playing a sistrum instrument. These weren't just decorations, they were reminders. The pharaoh's chamber was an extension of the temple, his acts an echo of divine myths. Even intimacy was state business. Imagine the horror of palace servants, one eye on the incense burners, another on whether the king's performance might ripple across the Nile's flood cycle. No pressure, your majesty, but the crops are depending on this. And humour sneaks in even here. You picture some overworked servant refilling the perfume fountain and muttering under his breath, "The gods may be eternal, but this cinnamon barrel is not." Small jokes in the middle of divine pressure. That's probably how ancient staff survived working in rooms where everything was too heavy to laugh at out loud. You back toward the chamber's heavy wooden doors, and before you leave you hear it. Faint giggling, muffled behind carved screens. Maybe it's lovers, maybe it's rivals, maybe it's another whispered ritual you'll never fully understand. All you know is that in these private rooms, the pharaoh's body was both bedroom and battlefield, both sanctuary and stage. And as the doors creak shut, you realize the kingdom outside could never truly separate itself from what happened in here. You leave the pharaoh's perfumed chambers and drift through a long colonnade until the air shifts again, cooler, drier, carrying the sound of chanting that rises and falls like the Nile at flood season. Ahead of you, torches flicker against stone walls, guiding you into the sacred precinct where rituals blurred the line between devotion and desire. This is where seduction dressed itself up as religion, and religion disguised itself as seduction. Your sandals slap softly against the limestone floor as you step into a temple courtyard. Statues loom, colossal and watchful, but your attention is drawn to the human figures, worshippers swaying in rhythm, hands raised, voices murmuring praises that sound suspiciously like invitations. This isn't Sunday school, this is theatre, drenched in incense and wine. One solid fact grounds you here. Fertility rituals were essential to Egyptian religion. The Nile's flood, their crops, even the stability of their society were tied to symbols of fertility. Priests and priestesses staged ceremonies that reenacted the union of gods like Isis and Osiris, Hathor and Horus, or even the sun and the earth. The performances might be symbolic, but their stakes were cosmic. Fail to honour the fertility rites and famine might stalk the land. No pressure again, your lettuce crop depends on somebody chanting awkwardly in the dark. But then comes the quirky tidbit. Some texts hint at ceremonies where temple dancers would wear almost nothing but elaborate jewelry and strategically draped lotus petals, their movements meant to embody Hathor herself. Imagine the awkwardness if you were a shy farmer invited to witness this, mumbling, "I just came here to pray for rain." Historians still argue whether these performances were literal seductions or metaphorical storytelling, but you can't shake the image of lotus petals fluttering into the sand mid-dance. The temple itself seems to hum with double meanings. Every carved relief on the wall can be read one way by a priest and another way by an ordinary villager. A scene of a goddess pouring water might look innocent until you learn that water represented not just fertility of fields, but fertility of people. You blink at the carving, suddenly realizing just how layered these symbols were, like a sacred meme only insiders truly understood. In the center of the courtyard, you imagine a ritual bed draped in linen, set up for ceremonies where union between gods was reenacted. Did priests actually climb onto that bed, or did they hover nearby chanting verses as offerings of bread, beer, and incense burned? That's where historians split again. Some argue these were strictly symbolic. Others insist they were dramatized to the point of performance art. You stand there, half expecting a priest to pop out and say, "Tonight's show is sponsored by the goddess Hathor. Please silence your shabtis before it begins." And humour seeps in naturally. Imagine one nervous initiate fumbling through a ritual dance, dropping a sistrum, a rattle-like instrument, and whispering, "Oops, the gods might have been forgiving, but the high priest probably wasn't." Somewhere in the echoes you hear centuries of giggles that were quickly stifled before turning into embarrassed coughs. But beneath the comedy lies power. By staging these rituals, the priests controlled access to divine fertility. If the rites worked, the Nile flooded on time, crops grew, children were born, and everyone credited the temple. If they failed, well, then you must have disrespected the ritual somehow, and it was probably your fault. That's a neat trick of authority. Make the performance ambiguous enough that you're always dependent on it, even when nothing changes. You close your eyes and listen to the rhythm of hand drums, the distant chime of bronze, the clapping of hands moving in hypnotic patterns. You almost feel yourself swaying, caught between reverence and unease. Are you here to worship or to watch? To be devoted or to be seduced? The lines blur until you're not sure you can tell anymore. And as the torches sputter, a breeze slips through the columns, carrying with it the faint smell of blue lotus. You inhale and suddenly everything feels heavier. Your body, your thoughts, even the night itself. For a moment you wonder if the gods are watching, or if this entire performance is designed to make you think they are. Either way, you're caught, swaying gently with the crowd, in a sacred dance that refuses to say where devotion ends and desire begins. The music fades into echoes as you shuffle down another stone corridor, only to find yourself stepping into a space where the air feels charged with secrecy. Here, masks and costumes hang like silent witnesses, their painted eyes glaring with permanent suspicion. You realize this is not the temple's public face anymore. This is the backstage, where ceremonies blurred into theatre and theatre blurred into something much more unsettling. Egyptians loved their symbolism, and in rituals of intimacy, anonymity mattered. A mainstream fact, masks were commonly used in religious ceremonies to represent gods and spirits, allowing the wearer to embody divine roles. You see them here: jackal masks for Anubis, falcon masks for Horus, cow-headed headdresses for Hathor. They weren't just props, they were licenses to become someone or something else. When you covered your face, you weren't you anymore, you were a vessel. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some surviving fragments suggest certain participants wore costumes that were, let's say, a little too revealing. Imagine a linen skirt that left more questions than answers, or a headdress so oversized it looked like cosplay gone wrong. There's even debate about whether masks were intentionally exaggerated, bigger noses, wider mouths, so that from a distance they looked cartoonish. You imagine an initiate nervously adjusting their crooked falcon mask, whispering, "Do I look divine enough?" while trying not to trip over the hem of their skirt. Historians still argue whether these costumes were used for genuine transformation or simply for dramatic flair. One camp insists that when a priest wore a mask of Horus, the god literally inhabited him. Another claims the masks were theatrical devices meant to impress the crowd with spectacle rather than spirit. You're caught between the theories, picturing both, a trembling villager convinced the god was truly present, and a snickering teenager at the back whispering, "That mask looks like it was made in 5 minutes." The rituals that unfolded here carried more than a touch of danger. By disguising faces, people were freed from personal accountability. Imagine a line of masked figures, swaying, chanting, their voices muffled but eerily unified. Without names or identities, the actions became more powerful and more unsettling. A kiss in the dark wasn't just a kiss, it was the union of gods. A touch wasn't just flesh, it was myth reenacted. Or at least, that's what they wanted you to believe. You pick up one of the discarded masks. The paint flakes under your fingers, and the hollow eyes seem to peer right through you. The room suddenly feels heavier, as though each mask has soaked up centuries of whispered rituals. You set it down quickly, pretending you're not spooked, but let's be honest, if you saw that in your bedroom at 2 a.m., you'd be sprinting out faster than an ancient scribe late for tax collection. And yes, there's humour in this strangeness. Picture the awkward logistics, someone trying to whisper a sacred verse through a giant cow mask, their voice echoing "moo" at the worst possible time, or a falcon-headed priest tripping on the steps and landing in an unholy heap. Ancient Egyptians might have been serious, but they weren't immune to slapstick accidents. Ritual or not, somebody was stifling laughter in the background. Yet secrecy remained the core. Masks and costumes created distance between the human and the act, leaving everyone guessing. Were those rites symbolic, literal, both? The ambiguity gave the priests power. You never really knew what happened behind the curtains, which made it easier to accept whatever version they fed you later. After all, it's hard to fact-check when the witnesses were all wearing jackal masks. You glance back at the array of painted faces, now lit by the dim flicker of your torch. For a moment, you think you see them moving, shifting, aligning into a crowd that watches you instead. The torch sputters, the air thickens, and you realize once you step into the ritual with a mask, the line between yourself and the divine isn't just blurred, it's gone. You leave the room of masks, still feeling the weight of those hollow eyes, and stumble into a smaller chamber with low shelves and baskets. At first glance, it looks like a pantry, but when you lean closer, you realize the contents aren't bread or figs. They're jars of strange mixtures, some dried, some sticky, some smelling suspiciously pungent. Welcome to the world of ancient contraceptives, where science, superstition, and comedy blended into a recipe you probably wouldn't want anywhere near your bedside table. Here's the mainstream fact. Ancient Egyptians were pioneers of contraception. Surviving medical papyri, like the famous Ebers papyrus, detail concoctions meant to prevent pregnancy. Women were instructed to insert mixtures into the body before intimacy, sometimes using honey, sometimes sour milk, and, most infamously, crocodile dung. Yes, crocodile dung. Imagine the poor scribe trying to write that down with a straight face. For prevention of conception, apply fresh crocodile excrement mixed with and you slam the scroll shut before finishing. And that's your quirky tidbit. The crocodile dung method wasn't just rumor, it's written down. Scholars think the dung's alkaline properties might bizarrely have had some effectiveness, though the risks of infection were probably worse than the problem it was supposed to solve. So yes, while it sounds absurd, it wasn't entirely random. Still, you can't help picturing some woman in 1500 BCE muttering, "There has got to be a better way." Historians still argue whether these prescriptions were widely used or only recorded as experiments by elite physicians. Some argue honey and acacia gum mixtures were more popular since acacia ferments into lactic acid, which actually has mild contraceptive properties. Others point out that crocodile dung might have been more symbolic than practical, invoking the crocodile's fearsome power to ward off unwanted consequences. Either way, the image lingers. Jars of dung stored neatly on a temple shelf, a priest nurse solemnly explaining dosage instructions. You lean closer to one of the jars, half expecting it to snarl at you. The smell alone is enough to send you staggering back, clutching your nose, wondering how anyone thought this was romantic. But then again, love makes people do weird things, like buying overpriced perfumes today or apparently smearing dung in ancient Egypt. And here's where the humour sneaks in. Imagine the awkward exchange between husband and wife. "Are you ready? 1 second, I need to prepare." "Wait, you're bringing that into bed?" Romance killed instantly. Forget candlelight, this was the ancient equivalent of bringing a skunk to date night. But don't laugh too hard. Some of these remedies were surprisingly sophisticated. Honey was valued not just for sweetness but for antibacterial properties, helping prevent infections. Women also used pessaries made from linen soaked in herbal solutions. Modern medicine admits some of these methods might have worked better than you'd think. Still, when the menu of options includes crocodile dung, you start questioning the overall vibe of Egyptian bedroom science. The shelves here also hold amulets, tiny carvings shaped like gods or animals. These weren't for contraception but for fertility boosts, tucked discreetly under pillows or tied around waists. It's a reminder that for every dung jar, there was also a charm meant to spark passion or protect intimacy. You can imagine a young couple nervously giggling as they tied one onto their bed frame, whispering prayers to Hathor, hoping for both romance and luck. You run your fingers along the dusty edge of the shelf and suddenly picture the lives these jars once touched. The village girl, too poor to buy honey, resorting to whatever concoction she could find. The wealthy noblewoman demanding only the most expensive herbs, dismissing the dung jars with a wrinkled nose. The priests balancing between science, superstition, and just enough mystery to keep their patients dependent. And as you back away, you can't help thinking of the callback. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen people joked about? Now imagine doubling down with crocodile dung birth control. Egyptians really knew how to commit to a theme. The torchlight flickers over tea. He jars one last time and you feel grateful you live in an era of pharmacies and discreet packaging. Here the line between medicine and ritual was smeared, sometimes literally. And as the chamber door creaks shut, the smell lingers, a pungent reminder that love and desperation have always been creative partners. You step away from the shelves of jars, shaking the crocodile stench from your memory, and drift into a chamber where the air feels heavier, not with incense this time, but with expectation. Here, the walls are covered with painted contracts, etched with lines of hieratic script, neat and formal. You've wandered into the world of Egyptian marriage contracts, where love, intimacy, and property rights mix together in agreements that read more like business deals than bedtime poetry. The mainstream fact is simple. In ancient Egypt, marriage was recognized by contract, not ceremony. Forget white dresses, priests, or flowers. If the papyrus said you were married, you were married. These contracts spelled out obligations, inheritance rights, and financial security. A woman might be promised a portion of her husband's property if the marriage ended, and in some cases, she could even initiate divorce. Progressive? Absolutely. Romantic? Well, not exactly. Picture sliding a papyrus across the bed and saying, "Sign here before we cuddle." Now for the quirky tidbit. Some contracts went into surprisingly specific detail about what each partner owed the other. One fragment suggests a husband promised not just financial support but regular supplies of oil for his wife's skin and wigs for her hair. You smile at the thought. Nothing says devotion like "I'll keep your beauty regimen funded." It's like the ancient version of "Don't worry babe, I'll cover your Netflix subscription." Historians still argue whether these contracts reflected actual day-to-day practice or were more like ideals, guidelines rather than realities. Did every farmer in a village have the same legal security as a noble family in Thebes? Or were most of these contracts aspirational, written to sound nice but seldom enforced? The papyri don't always give straight answers, and you're left wondering whether these eels were empowering, manipulative, or a bit of both. You wander farther into the chamber, and now you notice scribes at low tables, their reed pens scratching furiously, their tongues poking out in concentration. Each contract must be perfect. Mistakes in ink could mean disputes later. The scribe looks up, squinting at the nervous couple across from him. She fiddles with her amulet. He shifts uncomfortably, both knowing this isn't just a love story, it's a legal transaction. And here's where the humor sneaks in. Imagine the negotiations. "I promise you a third of my estate. Make it half and throw in a jar of honey." Deal. Romance, ancient Egyptian style, less about moonlit walks, more about bargaining like you're in a marketplace. But these agreements weren't heartless. By setting down expectations, they gave women unusual protection compared to other ancient cultures. A divorced woman could walk away with her dowry, sometimes even more, and a man who failed to meet his promises risked legal trouble. It's oddly comforting, like love insurance sealed in ink. Some contracts also hinted at whispered expectations behind closed doors. Though most avoided direct mention of intimacy, a few referred obliquely to duties of a husband or harmonious living. You can almost hear the scribe muttering, "I know what that means, but I'm not writing it out." The vagueness kept things dignified while everyone still knew what was being implied. You pause before one painted wall scene. A man and woman stand side by side holding hands, the hieroglyphs around them spelling out promises of loyalty. Yet even in the artwork, there's no kiss, no embrace. It's all formal, restrained, practical. The passion, if there was any, hid behind the ink. And yet, contracts weren't always enough. Midnight deals still happened. Lovers made promises under starlight, whispered outside the contracts, bending rules to their advantage. You imagine one scribe's nightmare, waking up to find the young couple he just signed yesterday already sneaking off with other partners, proving once again that no amount of papyrus can truly legislate desire. As you leave the chamber, the sound of scratching pens fades. You can still picture those couples, half nervous, half practical, signing their futures into ink. Love in ancient Egypt wasn't just about hearts or whispers. It was about contracts, obligations, and maybe a few sneaky side deals when no one was looking. You slip past the scribes and their papyrus contracts into a quieter hall where the scent of incense returns, mixed now with something sweeter, jasmine perhaps, and the faint metallic tang of bronze lamps. The walls here are carved with female figures, tall, graceful, eyes rimmed with kohl. These are not queens or noble wives, but women of the temples, priestesses whose roles flickered uneasily between devotion, service, and suspicion. A mainstream fact sets the scene. Priestesses of Hathor and other fertility goddesses held significant religious positions in Egypt. They performed music, dance, and rituals that were believed to maintain cosmic balance. Many were drawn from noble families, trained to sing hymns, shake the sistrum, and embody the goddess in ceremonies. Their presence was essential, their voices carrying prayers to the heavens. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some records hint that priestesses were nicknamed Shemsu, singers, but their duties often went far beyond music. Gossip suggested they acted as vessels of the goddess's love, embodying her presence in ways that blurred the sacred and the sensual. Imagine standing in a festival courtyard, hearing a priestess sing with hypnotic rhythm, and wondering, is she calling to the gods or to you? Historians still argue whether priestesses engaged in ritual intimacy or if later writers exaggerated their roles. Some argue they were essentially entertainers with a sacred badge, weaving music, perfume, and dance into ceremonies that symbolized fertility. Others suggest there may have been more direct involvement, with select priestesses serving in rituals too private to leave detailed records. The debate hovers like incense smoke, thick, fragrant, impossible to grasp. You move deeper into the chamber and hear the faint jingle of sistrums, bronze instruments rattled with rhythmic insistence. The sound echoes like a heartbeat, steady and trance-like. A row of women sways, their linen dresses catching torchlight, their hair perfumed with lotus oil. Their chants rise, soft at first, then insistent, pressing you toward a mood that feels equal parts worship and seduction. Humour slips in when you picture a priestess mid-performance rolling her eyes at an offbeat drummer, or one sighing dramatically when a worshipper faints too early from heat and wine. After all, even sacred performers had to deal with amateur audiences. Imagine centuries of side-eye exchanged behind veils, masked with polite devotion. But behind the grace lies power. Priestesses weren't powerless performers, they carried influence. Some came from elite households, wielding temple status as both spiritual and social currency. Their presence in rituals granted them authority in spaces men couldn't fully control. In a society where women often managed property and business, temple service gave another layer of visibility. Of course, that visibility also attracted suspicion. Were they respected or quietly resented, whispered admiration mixed with gossip about what really happened behind closed temple doors. You pause near a mural showing Hathor as a cow nurturing the pharaoh with divine milk. Around her, priestesses play instruments, their eyes downcast, their roles carefully choreographed. The image is maternal, devotional, yet it vibrates with intimacy. Was this nourishment purely symbolic, or did audiences perceive something more sensual beneath the sacred frame? The ambiguity is intentional, teasing those who watch. As you step toward the exit, you hear laughter, not mocking, but soft, intimate laughter from the shadows. A pair of priestesses, resting between rituals, sharing a private joke only they understand. Maybe they're teasing about a clumsy dancer, or the way the high priest overdid his incense. That moment of humor humanizes them. Women living inside a role that was both empowering and constraining, shaping Egypt's rituals while navigating their own desires. You leave the chamber with the sound of rattling sistrums lingering in your ears, half hymn, half lullaby. And you realize the truth. The priestesses of the night lived in a world of devotion wrapped in secrecy, where the goddess's voice sang through them, and where their own voices sometimes slipped through, laughing in the dark. You step back into the night air and wander toward a narrow stairway that leads down into a tomb. The air grows cooler, still and dry, as though it hasn't been disturbed for centuries. Your torch flickers across walls alive with color, murals that glow even in the dim light. At first they look familiar, men harvesting grain, women weaving, families gathered. But when you peer closer, you notice shapes, gestures, and poses that seem suggestive. You've stumbled into the strange gallery of tomb paintings, where the dead whispered through brushstrokes about what they wanted in the afterlife. Here's the mainstream fact. Egyptian tomb art was designed to provide the deceased with everything they'd need for eternity. Scenes of farming ensured eternal harvests. Banquets ensured eternal feasting, and, yes, intimate images sometimes promised eternal pleasure. To the Egyptians, the afterlife wasn't an abstract cloud, it was a continuation of earthly joys, just perfected and endless. Now for the quirky tidbit. Among the fragments, some paintings depict couples reclining together in what looks like tender embrace, with lotus flowers held near their noses. The lotus, symbol of rebirth, also carried erotic overtones. It was said to stimulate desire. Imagine being an ancient painter, dutifully illustrating your patron's eternal supplies of bread and beer, then being asked, "Oh, and don't forget to include me reclining with my wife. Make sure she looks especially happy." That commission must have been awkward. Historians still argue whether these images should be read literally or symbolically. Were the embraces genuine depictions of intimacy or simply metaphors for union, fertility, and continuity in the afterlife? One school claims the suggestive details prove the dead wanted physical pleasures for eternity. Another argues these were spiritual allegories, too sanitized to be lit. Iral, you glance at the murals yourself, tilting your head and think either way, someone's eternity was looking pretty cozy. The air smells faintly of dust and minerals as you study one wall showing a woman offering a man a lotus blossom, her hand hovering just close enough to imply intimacy without stating it outright. It's a visual tease, leaving just enough ambiguity to make future archaeologists squint for hours. You chuckle softly, realizing the ancient artists were masters of PG-13 suggestion long before Hollywood ever existed. Of course, not every tomb went for subtlety. A handful of rarer papyri, like the Turin erotic papyrus, show outright scenes of intimacy, graphic enough to make Victorian archaeologists blush. That papyrus wasn't exactly funerary art, but its existence proves Egyptians didn't shy away from explicit humor. Some think it was satire, poking fun at the very rituals you've been walking through. Imagine ancient scribes passing it around like the office meme of the week, giggling behind their reed pens while pretending to be serious. But here in the tomb, the vibe is less comic and more eerie. These images weren't for jokes, they were eternal contracts. The gestures carved into plaster were believed to come alive in the afterlife, ensuring the deceased would never be without companionship, comfort, or passion. It's like a wish list carved into stone: food, drink, music, and just enough affection to keep eternity from feeling lonely. You kneel near a corner where a small faded painting shows servants carrying jars of perfume while a couple sits together on a low couch. Their faces are serene, eyes locked in a gaze that seems oddly modern, affection, not just duty. You can almost hear the silence between them, the eternal hum of partnership preserved in pigment. For a moment you realize the ancients weren't just decorating, they were trying to capture emotion itself, to cheat death with art. And yet humor lingers even here. Imagine future archaeologists misinterpreting our wedding photos. This couple appears to be engaging in a ritual exchange of cake, likely symbolic of fertility. You laugh quietly to yourself, realizing we're not so different from them. Our snapshots, their murals, both are just attempts to say, we were here, and we loved, and we wanted that love to last. As you step back from the glowing walls, you feel both warmed and unsettled. Tomb paintings talk, booze. They don't explain. They leave you suspended between reverence and curiosity, between literal and symbolic, between fact and whisper. And as the torchlight fades, the painted figures seem almost to shift, as though their eternal embrace continues just out of reach. You climb out of the painted tomb, blinking as the night air returns, and wander along a colonnade that leads toward the royal quarter. The torches here burn brighter, guarded by stern-faced statues, because you are about to brush against one of Egypt's most unsettling secrets: incest within royal dynasties. The whispers of the pharaoh's beds didn't end with perfume fountains or political contracts. They extended into marriages that folded back on themselves, turning siblings into spouses in the name of divine legitimacy. The mainstream fact is this: Egyptian rulers, especially in later dynasties like the Ptolemies, frequently married their sisters or close relatives. The logic was simple, if unsettling. Since pharaohs were divine, their blood was sacred. Keeping it pure meant keeping it inside the family. By marrying siblings, they mirrored the gods themselves, like Isis and Osiris, who were both siblings and spouses. To ordinary people, it might have seemed strange, but to the throne, it was cosmic necessity. Then comes the quirky tidbit: some of these royal unions led to particularly tangled family trees. One Ptolemaic pharaoh, Ptolemy II, married his full sister Arsinoe II, and the two had coins minted with their faces side by side, proudly labelled as divine siblings. Imagine pulling that coin out to buy a loaf of bread, squinting at it and thinking, I did not need that reminder while I'm eating breakfast. Historians still argue how these marriages actually played out in private. Some suggest they were symbolic unions performed for the sake of ritual legitimacy, while the real personal lives of the royals were more discreet. Others argue they were very real marriages, producing heirs and scandals alike. The truth probably varied from dynasty to dynasty, but the effect was the same. The throne stayed in the family, and the gossip spread through every corridor of the palace. You wander deeper into the royal wing and picture a grand chamber where two siblings sit side by side on a gilded couch, servants fanning them while scribes record their titles. To the world outside, they are gods walking among mortals, their union a mirror of the heavens. To you, peeking from the shadows, it feels less divine and more awkward. You whisper to yourself, so family dinners must have been really complicated. The power behind these unions was undeniable, though. By marrying within the family, pharaohs ensured no rival noble house could claim the throne through marriage. The palace remained sealed, its secrets guarded not just by walls but by bloodlines. Every whispered ritual, every intimate act became both personal choice and political chess move. And humour finds a way here too. Imagine the royal children at playtime trying to explain their family tree to a confused servant. This is my mum, who's also my aunt, who's also my dad's wife. You picture the servant nodding politely while internally screaming, "I'm not paid enough for this." The walls here are decorated with reliefs of Isis and Osiris, their embrace carved in flowing lines. For the royals, this wasn't just myth, it was justification. If the gods did it, so could they. Still, you wonder how many courtiers whispered behind their palms, hiding smirks or unease as the pharaoh announced yet another sibling union. You pause at a narrow window, the Nile shimmering under moonlight. The river flows endlessly, carrying secrets downstream, secrets the villagers may have guessed but never dared say aloud. Incest wasn't something to be joked about openly, but you can bet servants shared stories in hushed tones after dark, weaving half-truths into gossip that drifted like incense smoke through the palace halls. As you turn back into the chamber, you feel the weight of those unions pressing down, a strange blend of divine symbolism, political necessity, and human awkwardness. The royals called it sacred, the gods called it precedent, but you, standing here centuries later, can only whisper, sometimes history is stranger than fiction. You step out of the suffocating royal chambers and into the open air again, where the night sky over the Nile looks more like velvet than darkness, pricked with stars that shimmer like tiny lamps. The river glides silently below, carrying boats lit with flickering torches. You follow the crowd toward the riverbank, where music and laughter swell. This is no ordinary procession. It's one of Egypt's night festivals, when ritual boats drift on moonlit waters and the sacred mingles freely with the suggestive. A mainstream fact, Egyptians held elaborate river festivals in honor of gods like Hathor, Isis, and Osiris. The Nile wasn't just water, it was a living artery of divine life, and these ceremonies often included symbolic unions between gods played out in song, dance, and ritual journeys. Statues of deities were loaded onto boats, floated downstream, and greeted by waiting crowds. The spectacle wasn't just worship, it was theatre meant to ensure fertility, abundance, and order. But here comes the quirky tidbit. Some accounts describe these boat festivals as more than just sacred parades. People drank heavily, danced wildly, and sometimes lost themselves in behavior that would make even the gods raise an eyebrow. The Feast of Drunkenness, associated with Hathor, was one such event, an excuse for villagers and nobles alike to drink until inhibitions vanished. Picture yourself wobbling on a boat deck, lotus flower in hand, chanting praises while simultaneously wondering if you're about to tumble into the river. Historians still argue whether these river processions included ritual intimacy aboard the boats themselves. Some argue the union of gods was purely symbolic, with statues standing in for deities. Others whisper that certain select participants, shielded by curtains on the decorated decks, acted out the divine myths in ways far more literal. You can almost hear the hushed debates of scholars. Was it drama, devotion, or a very ancient form of improv that nobody wanted written down too clearly? The boats themselves shimmer with decoration. Linen banners catch the moonlight, gold inlays on the hull sparkle, and the rhythmic beat of drums keeps the vessels in sync as they drift. You're swept up in the crowd lining the banks, farmers, scribes, servants, and nobles all pressed together, swaying to the same rhythm. For one night, hierarchies blur. The fisherman's laughter mingles with the priest's chant. The noblewoman's perfume drifts over the farmer's shoulder. It's messy, chaotic, and strangely unifying. And of course, humour slips in. Imagine one drunk noble trying to climb onto a ritual barge only to be shoved back into the water by an unimpressed priest, or a boat's torch sputtering out at the worst moment, leaving the divine statue floating in darkness as the crowd gasps. These festivals had all the drama of a Broadway show, but with the added danger of crocodiles lurking just below the surface. You close your eyes and hear the sounds, drums pulsing, flutes shrieking, laughter bubbling, water slapping against wooden hulls. The night smells of spilled beer, lotus petals, and river mud. You almost sway yourself, caught up in the hypnotic flow, your body loosening as though the Nile itself is coaxing you to let go. The torches burn lower and the boats drift farther into the dark. From the decks, shadows move in ways you can't quite decipher. Dancers, priests, lovers. You strain to see, but the ambiguity is the point. The mystery fuels devotion, gossip, and awe. Just like the temple whispers, the boats keep their secrets. You only get glimpses, flashes of movement, enough to leave your imagination restless long after the festival ends. And as the river swallows the torchlight, leaving only stars overhead, you realize the Nile isn't just water tonight, it's a mirror, reflecting all the desires, fears, and hopes of the people pressed along its banks. The current carries the gods downstream, and with them the thrill of rituals that blurred sacred vows with very human longings. The river festival drifts into memory as you follow the crowd back through narrow streets toward dimly lit homes. The laughter fades, replaced by the softer murmur of door bolts sliding shut, of couples retreating behind walls of mud brick. You step into one such house, not a palace, not a temple, just a modest dwelling, and find yourself in a chamber where the air is thick with perfume and secrecy. Here lies another layer of Egypt's intimacy, charms and amulets slipped discreetly under the sheets. The mainstream fact is clear. Egyptians deeply believed in protective magic, especially when it came to matters of fertility and desire. Amulets weren't just jewelry, they were tools of spiritual insurance, guarding against impotence, miscarriages, or awkward misfires during the night. Scarabs, lotus flowers, the eye of Horus, all of them could be carved small enough to tuck beneath pillows or tie around the waist. Desire, they believed, needed divine reinforcement. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some amulets were shockingly blunt in design. Archaeologists have uncovered figurines shaped like male and female anatomy, sometimes so exaggerated that even modern museum curators blush before displaying them. Imagine slipping one of those under your pillow and whispering a prayer. Please, Hathor, bless tonight's efforts. You can't help but chuckle, wondering if some poor craftsman felt embarrassed every time a customer ordered another fertility figurine in bulk. Historians still argue whether these charms were truly believed to work or if they were half-joking talismans, part placebo, part tradition. One camp insists Egyptians treated them with deadly seriousness. Every failed harvest, every failed attempt at pregnancy could be blamed on neglecting the right charm. Another suggests some were playful tokens exchanged between lovers, a wink carved into faience. The truth probably lies somewhere between sacred protection for some, cheeky gift for others. You kneel beside a bedstead made of woven reeds low to the ground and picture a couple lying there, whispering in the torchlight. The faint clink of an amulet tied to the headboard gives reassurance. It isn't just them in this moment, but Hathor herself, watching, blessing, or maybe smirking knowingly. The idea is both comforting and a little unsettling. Who wants divine spectators when you're trying to relax? And here's where humour slides in. Picture a husband fumbling in the dark, accidentally grabbing the amulet string instead of his wife's hand and whispering nervously, "Oh, sorry, wrong one." Or a charm slipping under the bed mid-act, leading to frantic shuffling around on the floor while the gods look down, unimpressed. Ancient intimacy wasn't free from clumsy moments, and the amulets may have been less about preventing cosmic disaster and more about laughing away the awkwardness. Still, beneath the jokes was real fear. Egyptians dreaded infertility as much as they dreaded famine. A barren household was considered incomplete, a failure not just for the couple, but for their ancestors and descendants. Amulets gave them hope, a tangible sign that they had done their part, invited the gods in, and deserved success. The little figures of Bes, the dwarf god of protection, grinned from amulets tucked beneath blankets, his squat body and lion mane meant to scare away evil spirits. His face, comical and fierce, was a reminder that the divine could protect with humor as well as fear. You run your fingers over one such carving, its surface smooth from centuries of handling. You imagine the thousands of whispered prayers it absorbed, pleas for passion, for children, for comfort. The charm feels almost warm, as though echoes of those hopes still linger. You place it back gently, realizing it was never just an object. It was a promise, fragile but fiercely held. As you step outside the mud brick home, the night air greets you again, cool and heavy with lotus scent. Behind you, couples settle into beds where stone charms, painted eyes, and sacred dwarves keep watch in the shadows. And you think, maybe the amulets didn't guarantee success, but they gave people the courage to hope. The night pulls you farther from the quiet houses and down a dusty road toward a cluster of mud brick dwellings pressed tight against each other. This is no grand palace or gilded temple. It's Deir el-Medina, the workers' village where the artisans who built the Valley of the Kings lived, laughed, and whispered their own confessions. Here, history is less polished, more human. You slip between the narrow lanes, hearing gossip clatter louder than chisels, stories about love and intimacy that never made it onto the official papyri. A mainstream fact first. Deir el-Medina has given us more personal details about ancient Egyptian life than almost any other site. Archaeologists unearthed letters, love poems, complaints, and even court records written on ostraca, broken pottery shards used as scrap notepaper. And among these fragments are glimpses into the nightly lives of ordinary Egyptians, affairs, quarrels, longing, and plenty of inventive problem-solving. Now for the quirky tidbit. One ostracon records a man scolding his neighbour for borrowing his wife's affection while he was away at work. The tone is less fiery rage, more annoyed resignation, as if the man were saying, "Come on, couldn't you at least wait until I finished chiseling the pharaoh's tomb?" You can almost imagine him rolling his eyes, muttering under his breath, and scribbling his complaint with a dull reed pen. Historians still argue whether these records represent common behaviour or just exceptional scandals. Was infidelity rampant in the workers' village, or were these just the messy highlights preserved by chance? One camp insists the gossip reflects a lively, close-knit community where secrets couldn't stay hidden. Another points out that for every scandal scribbled on pottery, countless quiet, faithful marriages left no trace. Either way, what survives paints a picture of relationships far messier and more relatable than the formal contracts back in the palace. You step into one small courtyard and imagine an evening here, neighbours sitting on stools sharing beer, children running barefoot through the dust. And over in the corner, someone is whispering about the mason who came home late, or the weaver who sent too many gifts to the woman next door. The air hums with laughter, jealousy, and desire, ordinary emotions that turned every narrow lane into a stage. And here comes the humour. Egyptians in Deir el-Medina weren't above writing bawdy graffiti. Some walls carried doodles of suggestive scenes, little more than ancient bathroom humour. Imagine a bored worker sketching a joke on a wall deep inside a royal tomb, then chuckling to himself, "Let the gods deal with that one." Humanity, it seems, always finds a way to sneak a dirty joke into even the most sacred projects. But the gossip wasn't all laughs. The records also reveal quarrels over inheritance, accusations of misconduct, and even love spells scratched onto shards, desperate pleas for divine help in attracting someone's affection. You pick up one such ostracon, reading faint hieratic strokes that translate roughly to, "May she never sleep until she comes to me." You sigh, realizing this was no polished myth, but the raw, sleepless yearning of a stonemason with a crush. The homes here are modest: mud brick walls, reed mats for bedding, jars of beer stacked neatly in corners. Yet beneath the simple setting, the same anxieties lingered: passion, betrayal, desire, disappointment. You picture one couple whispering in bed about stolen kisses and jealous glances, while next door another laughs quietly about a flirtation gone wrong. Their confessions may not have been meant for eternity, but the shards they scribbled on carried those voices straight into your hands tonight. As you leave the village, the sound of gossip seems to follow you, weaving with the chirp of crickets and the faint rush of wind through palm trees. The pharaohs may have had perfume fountains and divine unions, but the workers of Deir el-Medina had something just as enduring: the everyday drama of love, told one broken potsherd at a time. The narrow alleys of Deir el-Medina fade behind you, and now you follow the sound of drums, laughter, and the slosh of beer jugs. The air grows thick with the smell of barley brew and roasting meat. Before you even see it, you know you've stumbled into one of Egypt's most infamous celebrations, the festivals of drunken ecstasy, where entire communities abandoned restraint and let themselves unravel under Hathor's watchful eyes. The mainstream fact is simple. Festivals honoring Hathor, goddess of love, music, and intoxication, were marked by ritual drinking. The most famous was the Feast of Drunkenness, when Egyptians consumed beer until they passed out, reenacting the myth where humanity was saved by getting the bloodthirsty goddess Sekhmet too drunk to continue her rampage. In these celebrations, intoxication wasn't just tolerated, it was sacred. Drinking yourself silly was a religious duty. And here's the quirky tidbit: beer in Egypt wasn't quite the bubbly pint you picture today. It was thick, porridge-like, often sipped through straws to avoid chunks of grain floating in it. Imagine trying to look seductive while slurping on a chunky brew, cheeks puffed, hoping your crush doesn't notice the foam on your chin. The comedy practically writes itself. Historians still argue whether the chaos of these festivals was more symbolic or literal. Some suggest the mass intoxication was ritual theatre, carefully supervised by priests to represent humanity's near destruction and redemption. Others argue villagers genuinely drank themselves into oblivion, turning the Nile's banks into one massive beer-soaked block party. You look around at the swaying crowd and think, honestly, it feels like both. The scene before you is wild. Women sway with lotus garlands tangled in their hair. Men stumble, arm in arm. Voices rise in songs that lurch between hymns and bawdy ballads. Wren dart underfoot, giggling as adults stagger, pretending not to notice when a noblewoman clutches a jug tighter than her jewelry box. Hierarchies collapse here. For one night, the high priest and the fisherman both slur the same prayers to Hathor, their words dissolving into laughter. And then comes the humour again. You watch a group of worshippers so tipsy they forget the steps to a sacred dance, accidentally forming a conga line instead, or the priest who solemnly tries to explain cosmic order while hiccuping every third word. Even in the middle of a sacred myth, human absurdity always finds a way to poke through. But behind the laughter lies power. These festivals weren't just wild nights, they were pressure valves. Daily life in Egypt was strict, hierarchical, and bound by rules. For a single festival, that structure cracked open. People loosened their linen belts, swapped partners in dance, sang out confessions they'd never dare utter sober. The sanctioned chaos reminded everyone that joy, desire, and abandon were as necessary as order and restraint. Without nights like these, the carefully wound gears of Egyptian society might grind to a halt. You close your eyes and hear the drunken chants ripple across the Nile, echoing with a strange beauty. Even the slurred prayers carry a kind of sincerity, a desperate plea for fertility, for renewal, for release. Beer-soaked or not, They believed Hathor was listening, and as the festival reaches its crescendo, you feel the crowd sway like a single body, laughter and song melting into the rhythm of drums. It's messy, absurd, intoxicating, and yet strangely comforting. In this chaos, you see the heart of Egypt not in its polished temples or golden thrones, but in its people, human, flawed, longing and laughing even as they prayed. When the drums fade and the crowd collapses into sleep, the Nile keeps flowing, washing away the echoes of spilled beer and whispered confessions. You step away quietly, leaving them to dream their beer-soaked dreams under the watchful stars. The riverbank grows quiet after the night of wild celebration. You wander back toward the city, the streets damp with spilled beer, the dust clinging to your sandals. Torches burn low, throwing long, trembling shadows on the walls. You pass a small group of guards standing stiffly, their spears crossed, their faces unreadable. The laughter of the festival has faded, replaced by hushed voices and a tension in the air that makes you walk slower. You're stepping into the darker side of the Egyptian night, into the punishments reserved for those who dared cross the unspoken lines of desire. A mainstream fact sets the tone. Egyptian law was surprisingly advanced, with written legal codes and courts that handled everything from property disputes to accusations of adultery. Cheating on a spouse wasn't just a personal betrayal, it could be a legal crime, especially if it disrupted inheritance rights or involved members of the royal household. Punishments ranged from divorce and financial penalties to, in extreme cases, physical mutilation or exile. Imagine the fear of not just losing your spouse's trust, but also your home, your property, or even parts of your body. Sleep might not come easy under those rules. Now, the quirky tidbit. One papyrus suggests that men caught in an affair with a married woman might be forced into public humiliation, paraded through the streets wearing a necklace of severed fish. It sounds almost comedic, smelling like a fish market while the neighbors whisper and laugh. But to the Egyptians, it was deadly serious. You imagine the poor culprit walking past the same villagers he once bragged to, now red-faced as a child runs after him shouting, "Fish man! Fish man!" Historians still argue about how widespread these punishments were. Some scholars believe many of the harsher penalties, like cutting off noses or executions, were more threats than regular practice, designed to scare people into obedience rather than fill the courts with endless scandals. Others argue that at least in the royal court, where reputation was everything, punishments were harsh and very real. The truth may never be settled, but either way, the whispers about them were enough to keep most people awake at night, staring nervously at their reed ceilings. You drift into a courtyard where a trial is unfolding under the dim glow of torches. A woman, accused of straying, kneels before a stern judge. Scribes sit cross-legged, ready to record every word. Her husband stands stiffly, arms crossed, his face caught between outrage and embarrassment. The judge demands oaths to the gods, and suddenly you hear the terrifying weight of it all. This isn't just a private matter anymore, it's a cosmic crime, an offense against Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. You feel a shiver, imagining what it would be like to have your most private choices dragged into the open, weighed like a heart on Anubis's scales. And still, humor pokes its head through. You picture a defendant trying to argue their way out. "Your Honor, I wasn't unfaithful. I was just checking her amulet collection." The judge raises an eyebrow, scribes exchange glances, and someone coughs to hide a laugh. Ancient or modern, excuses don't always sound convincing when whispered under torchlight. But behind the laughter lies fear. Punishment was meant to be both deterrent and display, reminding everyone that intimacy wasn't just private business. It was tied to cosmic stability, property inheritance, and political order. To break the rules was to risk not only humiliation but the wrath of gods and kings. You linger for a moment as the accused woman swears an oath before the goddess Hathor, her hands trembling, her voice shaking. She insists on her innocence, but the whispers ripple through the crowd. Some believe her, some don't, but all of them are listening. Secrets may belong to individuals, but scandals belong to everyone. As the trial ends, you slip away into the dark, the echo of the judge's voice still bouncing between the walls. Punishments in the shadows, sometimes laughable, sometimes brutal, remind you that for the ancients, desire was never free. It was a coin, a contract, and if misused, a sentence. You leave the tense courtyard where punishments were whispered and wander toward the outskirts of a temple precinct where torchlight reveals statues not of kings or gods, but of animals, strange, sacred, unsettling. Their carved eyes gleam in the flicker, and for a moment you wonder if they're watching you back. Welcome to the bizarre realm where mythic animals became part of ritual play, creatures woven into symbols of desire, power, and fear. Here's the mainstream fact. Animals were central to Egyptian religion. Cats, crocodiles, ibises, bulls, and falcons weren't just animals, they were living embodiments of gods. The Apis bull, for example, was worshipped in Memphis as a direct manifestation of Ptah, and rituals surrounding him were tied to fertility and renewal. When the bull died, his body was mummified with the same care as royalty. Imagine entire processions dedicated not to a pharaoh, but to one very pampered cow. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some fertility rites involved symbolic acts where animals were present, or represented through masks, songs, or dances. One obscure text even hints at women wearing headdresses shaped like cow's ears to invoke Hathor, or men donning falcon wings to channel Horus. You can't help but grin at the thought of a priest solemnly flapping his arms in the middle of a candle-lit chamber, insisting it was divine performance, not comedy. Historians still argue whether these animal-linked rituals involved actual contact with sacred beasts or whether the presence was entirely symbolic. Some claim temple courtyards occasionally staged processions where bulls or cats were paraded as part of fertility celebrations, their mere sight enough to invoke divine energy. Others argue these whispers were exaggerated, that most of the animal involvement was artistic symbolism, murals, chants, and costumes rather than real four-legged participants. The truth remains blurry, much like the shadows now dancing on the temple wall. You step closer to a relief showing Hathor as a cow, her body adorned with jewelry, a sun disk between her horns. Beneath her, human figures lie in poses that look part devotional, part intimate. To you, it looks uncomfortably like humans and animals locked together in ritual metaphor. To them, it was sacred, an image of fertility, nurturing, and cosmic renewal. Still, you can't help muttering under your breath. Imagine trying to explain that mural to your kids. Humor peeks in again when you consider the logistics. Imagine being the priest assigned to walk an enormous Apis bull through a narrow temple doorway, all while chanting solemnly. One wrong step and suddenly your less divine ritual, more slapstick disaster. You can practically hear the muffled laughter of acolytes when the sacred cow decided to, let's say, bless the courtyard at an inopportune moment. Yet behind the absurdity was deep reverence. Animals weren't props, they were bridges to the divine. To touch the fur of a temple cat was to brush against Bastet's essence. To watch the Apis bull bellow was to hear Ptah's voice. To invoke crocodiles in fertility charms was to borrow their terrifying strength. And to paint Hathor with a cow's face was to insist that motherhood, nourishment, and desire were all animal instincts sanctified by the gods. You stand quietly as the night breeze ruffles the papyrus reeds near the temple's edge. The animal statues seem to glow faintly, their shadows stretching like guardians. For the Egyptians, animals weren't other. They were participants in the drama of life, death, and intimacy, creatures who reminded humans that sacred energy pulsed in every living body. Still, as you turn to leave, one carved crocodile's grin seems a little too wide. You laugh nervously, remembering the dung jars from earlier, and whisper, "Of course the crocodiles had the last laugh." The carved crocodile grin lingers in your mind as you step into a quieter chamber, its walls lined with shelves of brittle scrolls. The air smells of ink, dust, and the faint tang of resin. A scribe's ghostly presence seems to linger here, reed pen scratching across papyrus, whispering forbidden words into the margins of history. You've entered the secretive realm of magical papyri, scrolls filled with spells of seduction, protection, and revenge, all tied to the most intimate corners of human life. Here's the mainstream fact. Egyptian magical texts were widespread and practical. People used spells for everything, warding off snakes, ensuring a safe childbirth, or securing a lover's affection. These weren't fringe beliefs, they were daily tools. Magic, or Heka, was considered as real as medicine. For Egyptians, chanting the right words or burning the right herbs was simply another way of tipping the scales in your favor. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some love spells instructed the practitioner to burn hair or fingernail clippings from the target of their affection, mixing the ashes with honey or wine to create a potion. You can't help but laugh, imagining a nervous lover sneaking scissors into a crush's house. "I'm just here to borrow, a lock of hair." Romantic? Maybe not. Creepy? Definitely. Effective? Historians still argue about that one. And indeed, the scholars remain divided. Were these spells sincere attempts at manipulation or symbolic gestures that soothed the practitioner more than they affected the target? Some argue the papyri show a society deeply convinced of magic's power. Others insist many were just ritual performances, comfort blankets in written form. You glance at a scroll detailing an incantation to make a woman burn with desire until she comes to you, and think, this is either an ancient Tinder hack or a very unhealthy obsession. You unmar. On one brittle piece of papyrus, its hieratic script still bold after centuries, the words instruct the reader to draw a figure of Anubis, place it under the bed, and whisper verses while sprinkling natron salt. Supposedly, this would bind two lovers together under the god's watchful eyes. You can imagine someone doing this in secret, heart racing, convinced that a jackal-headed deity was listening in on their midnight desperation. Humor sneaks in, as always. Picture a husband waking up to find his bed full of salt and a badly drawn Anubis sketch under the mattress. "Honey, care to explain why the god of embalming is sleeping with us?" Ancient domestic arguments must have had their share of strange evidence. But the power of these spells lay less in their absurdity and more in their intimacy. They gave people the illusion of control over what was most uncontrollable, another person's heart. A woman might chant verses to cool her husband's wandering eyes. A man might scribble charms to make his rival stumble. Love, lust, jealousy, all the messy corners of human life found their way onto papyrus, sealed with ink and whispered over in candlelight. You run your fingers across another scroll, this one describing a ritual bath in milk and lotus petals to increase allure. The instructions are so detailed you almost expect to see a recipe card tucked at the end. You wonder if some ancient woman rolled her eyes at the hassle, muttering, "If he doesn't notice me now, milk baths aren't going to fix it." The chamber feels heavier as you linger, the weight of centuries of whispered desperation pressing from the walls. Each spell is a confession, a glimpse into someone's private longing or fear. They weren't kings or priests, just ordinary people trying to bend the universe to their will, one awkward chant at a time. As you roll the papyrus shut and set it back onto the shelf, the air grows still. You almost hear a whisper trailing after you, soft and sly. What spell would you write if the gods still listened? The whispers of papyri fade as you step back into the open night, the stars glimmering overhead like 1,000 cautious eyes. You follow the Nile downstream, past temple courtyards and palace walls, until the air changes again. It smells of spices, resin and sweat, foreign scents, not born of Egypt but carried by ships from across the sea. You've reached the ports where traders, sailors and strangers brought not just goods, but new temptations, new scandals and new stories that slipped eagerly into Egyptian nights. Here's the mainstream fact. Egypt was a hub of trade, a crossroads where cultures collided. Greeks, Nubians, Phoenicians and later Romans all docked their ships along the Nile. They carried not just gold, wine and cedar wood, but also ideas, rituals and customs. Egypt was never sealed off. It was porous, absorbing and transforming whatever drifted in, and nowhere was that more obvious than in the realm of intimacy and desire. Now for the quirky tidbit. Records hint that Egyptian women sometimes wore wigs styled in foreign fashions to appear more exotic to lovers. One particularly odd note suggests a Nubian wig was prized for its allure, even if the wearer's natural hair looked nothing like it. Imagine trying to flirt with your neighbour while balancing a heavy imported hairpiece, muttering, "Don't worry, it's authentic." The ancient equivalent of ordering something flashy from an overseas catalogue. Historians still argue whether Egypt embraced these foreign practices enthusiastically or resisted them, labelling outsiders as dangerous temptations. Some scholars claim ports like Naucratis became hotbeds of cross-cultural mingling, with Greek courtesans and Egyptian priests mixing over cups of wine. Others argue the whispers of scandal were exaggerated by later writers, eager to exoticize Egypt as a land of temptation. You look at the crowded port in your mind's eye, torches flaring, strangers laughing in tongues you barely understand, and suspect the truth is both temptation and fear, fascination and suspicion, all tangled together. You wander past stacked amphorae of wine, hearing sailors boast loudly about conquests, both mercantile and personal. A Greek mercenary leans too close to an Egyptian dancer, offering her a necklace in exchange for a smile. Down the alley, a Nubian trader hums a tune while slipping a carved charm into a lover's hand. Everywhere you turn, deals blur into flirtations, business slides into pleasure. And yes, humour thrives here. Imagine a sailor stumbling off a ship after months at sea, only to find himself hopelessly out of his depth with Egyptian love poems. He offers a clumsy line, mangling the words, while the woman listening hides her laugh behind a lotus fan. Some things never change. Romance has always been at least half awkward comedy. But behind the laughter lies unease. Egyptians feared foreign influence even as they indulged in it. Priests warned that outsiders brought not only new fashions but dangerous spells, disruptive desires and unfamiliar gods who might upset the balance of Ma'at. And yet the allure of the exotic was irresistible. A kiss with someone who spoke another language must have felt like stepping into myth itself. Strange, thrilling, forbidden. You pause at the sight of a painted wall inside a riverside tavern, showing Hathor raising a wine cup while a row of foreigners kneels before her. The message is clear. Egypt was the centre, the foreigners orbiting, but you can't help wondering how many locals secretly longed for that orbit to draw them closer, to taste what felt both dangerous and divine. The air thickens with spice and song, the voices of sailors and lovers mingling in 1,000 accents. You walk away slowly, realizing Egypt's nights weren't just filled with their own rituals and secrets, they were crowded with the whispers of strangers too. Every kiss, every laugh, every bargain in these ports left a trace on the sands, mixing Egypt's own forbidden practices with the tempting echoes of distant worlds. The crowded port drifts behind you, the mingling accents fading into the night breeze. You follow the Nile northward, its water darker now, its edges quieter, as if the river itself senses a change. Temples that once pulsed with chants stand more subdued. The perfume of festivals has thinned to a faint trace. You are walking into the decline, the slow fading of Egypt's secret rites as new rulers, new religions, and new powers dimmed the old lamps of desire. Here's the mainstream fact. By the later dynasties, especially during the Greco-Roman period and the rise of Christianity, many of Egypt's intimate rituals lost their prominence. What was once seen as sacred fertility rite became rebranded as superstition, even sin. As cultural tides shifted, practices tied to gods like Hathor and Isis were absorbed, altered, or outright suppressed. The new order sought discipline, clarity, and control. The blur between piety and passion was no longer tolerated. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Egyptian love spells didn't disappear, they were recycled. Greek magical papyri, written centuries later, still contain Egyptian formulas for attraction and desire, complete with references to ancient deities. Imagine a Greek scribe in Alexandria copying down a love incantation involving crocodile dung and thinking, "I don't get it, but it must work. It's Egyptian." Old magic lingered dressed in new clothes, slipping through the cracks of history like whispers that refused to die. Historians still argue whether the decline was gradual assimilation or sharp suppression. Some say the rituals of passion slowly faded as temples closed and priests lost power. Others claim authorities actively stamped them out, labeling them dangerous, immoral, or foreign. The truth lies in fragments. Papyri that suddenly stopped mentioning certain gods, shrines abandoned mid-construction, amulets buried deeper as if hiding from watchful eyes. You step into a half-ruined temple. The columns are cracked, the roof half-fallen, yet the carvings of Hathor still smile faintly, her cow's ears peeking through the rubble. Once, dancers would have rattled sistrums here, their laughter echoing with beer and lotus. Now, silence. You brush dust from a carving of Isis, her arms outstretched, and wonder how many whispered rituals she witnessed before the prayers shifted to new names. And yet, humor clings even to decline. Picture an aging priest trying to convince skeptical youths, "Trust me, the dung charms work." The teenagers roll their eyes, muttering, "Okay, Grandpa," before sneaking off to try Greek wine instead. Every generation thinks the old ways are ridiculous, even when they once held the world together. But beneath the jokes, you sense the loss. For centuries, Egyptians blurred sacred and sensual, weaving intimacy into cosmic order. With the decline came separation, religion stripped of playfulness, desire stripped of sanctity. What was once whispered as divine became whispered as shame. The torchlight of the old rituals dimmed, leaving only shadows of what once bound gods and mortals in candle-lit mystery. You walk through the crumbled doorway and feel the night air pressing soft against your skin. The Nile still flows, indifferent to temples and time. Perhaps the river remembers the chants, the laughter, the drunken hymns. Perhaps in its currents, some of those secrets still swirl, unseen but not gone. And as you listen to the water lapping against the stones, you realize decline doesn't erase, it only buries. And whispers buried deep have a way of resurfacing. The broken temple crumbles into silence behind you, and you walk once more along the riverbank. The Nile gleams under the moon, its silver surface hiding centuries of echoes. You lie down on the cool sand, and the weight of everything you've seen presses gently on your chest. The whispered temple rites, the pharaoh's perfumed chambers, the drunken festivals, the amulets hidden under beds. the gossip etched on potsherds. Each memory feels like a ripple, faint but persistent, tugging you deeper into stillness. One mainstream fact drifts through your thoughts. Egypt's obsession with the afterlife meant nothing was ever truly gone. Every ritual, every secret act was believed to echo forever in the halls of eternity. That belief shaped how they lived, how they loved, and how they feared. Even tonight, thousands of years later, you feel those echoes brushing softly against your ears. And then the quirky tidbit, some late tomb texts hint that the deceased could request companionship in the afterlife, not just food, drink, and music, but affection, intimacy, and laughter. Imagine someone carefully commissioning eternity with not just a banquet table, but a bed. It's both sweet and slightly absurd, as though the dead were saying, "Eternity sounds great, but only if I'm not lonely." Historians still argue whether these echoes shaped later traditions, whether the mingling of sacred and sensual in Egypt seeped into Greek mystery cults, Roman festivals, even medieval love charms. The debate continues, half conjecture, half convincing. Yet as you listen to the Nile's hum, it hardly matters. The whispers are still here, regardless of who claims ownership. The night slows. The stars stretch into long trails as your eyelids grow heavy. The Nile sighs like a lullaby, carrying the secrets of lovers, priests, and drunk festival-goers downstream into eternity. You feel the weight of history soften, its sharp edges fading into gentle waves. And now comes the wind down. The sand beneath you cools as the desert night deepens, every grain pressing softly, evenly, like a calming hand against your restless thoughts. The torches are gone, the drums have faded, the gossip has dissolved into silence. What remains is only the hush of water and the sigh of reeds swaying at the river's edge. The masks, the amulets, the festivals, they dissolve into mist, leaving no burden, no urgency, only echoes that grow quieter with every breath. You inhale slowly, and the air is softer now, less heavy with incense and beer, more like clean wind rolling over the river. Exhale, and the weight of strange rituals drifts out of you, carried away like smoke rising into starlight. Every muscle lengthens, loosens, untangles, as though history itself has released its grip. The gods, the whispers, even the scandals, they all step back into shadow, leaving you unbothered. The only presence now is the steady Nile, flowing without judgment, without secrets, without end. Its rhythm matches your breath, long and unhurried, each inhale and exhale lapping like water against the shore. The stars dim behind your closing eyes, and the moon becomes softer, more distant, until even its glow dissolves. You are left floating in a vast, calm darkness. Not frightening, not lonely, but safe, as if the river has cradled you in its eternal arms. And so you let go, you drift, you breathe, you rest. The echoes of Egypt fade into silence, and the only sound that remains is the soft hum of your own slowing breath. Sleep comes, gentle and certain, carrying you into dreams where even history grows quiet.